Everyone keeps saying this story ends with Sean Diddy Combs, that once he falls, the curtain closes, the damage is contained, and the industry moves on. But that assumption is exactly the problem, because Diddy was never the final boss. He was the decoy. While the public fixates on one name, one scandal, one arrest, something far more unsettling stays untouched above him. Power that doesn't show up in headlines, power that doesn't need to speak, and power that has survived every cleanup before this one. That's where this story takes a turn nobody expected. On one side, you have 50 Cent loud, relentless, and impossible to ignore. He's been saying for months that silence equals endorsement, and that if nobody talks, the culture looks complicit. On the other side, you have Elon Musk not shouting, not ranting, but holding something far more dangerous than words. Data, messages, receipts, years of private conversations most people assumed would never see daylight. And that's what makes this moment different. Because when someone like Diddy starts falling and certain names still look untouchable, you have to ask why. Who's protected, who's nervous, and who's hoping you stop digging right now? To understand that, you have to see how this system actually works. What makes 50 Cent different in this moment isn't courage, it's motive. He didn't step forward because he wanted attention. He stepped forward because he understood what silence would mean if he didn't. In an industry where everyone claims they didn't know staying quiet doesn't look neutral anymore. It looks strategic. And 50 has been clear about one thing from the start: if nobody speaks, the culture itself becomes the shield. That's the warning most people missed. He's said repeatedly that this isn't just about one man behaving badly, it's about what happens when everyone else pretends nothing happened, when insiders protect their access, when careers matter more than accountability. In that environment, silence stops being passive, it becomes participation. And that silence isn't accidental. There's an enforced quiet that runs through entertainment. You see it in how fast stories disappear, how interviews avoid obvious questions, how people rush to clarify what parties they didn't attend instead of addressing what everyone's actually asking. Careers are protected that way, brands stay clean, and uncomfortable chapters get buried under moving forward language. 50 knows how this works because he's watched it happen for decades. He's seen people get iced out for saying too much and rewarded for saying nothing at all. That's why he keeps talking even when it costs him relationships, because once the silence sets in, the narrative locks. But here's the part that really matters. Noise alone has never scared powerful people. Outrage fades, headlines pass. What actually makes them nervous is when noise turns into something permanent. And that's where this story shifts. What separates 50 Cent from everyone else right now isn't recklessness, it's clarity. When the allegations started surfacing and the industry went quiet, he recognized the pattern immediately. He's seen this movie before. The silence, the careful wording, the sudden amnesia from people who were once everywhere. And to him, that silence was more dangerous than any accusation because it sends a message without saying a word. That's why he stepped forward when others stayed frozen. 50 has made it clear that his fear isn't backlash or getting labeled difficult. His fear is what silence implies. When nobody speaks, it doesn't look like uncertainty, it looks like agreement. It looks like protection. And worse, it looks like the culture itself is willing to absorb anything as long as the money keeps flowing. That's the warning he's been repeating over and over. If no one speaks, the culture looks complicit. And this quiet isn't organic, it's enforced. Careers in entertainment don't survive by accident. They're protected through access favors and knowing when to look the other way. Stories don't disappear because they aren't true, they disappear because they're inconvenient. Questions don't go unanswered because there are no answers, but because answering them would threaten too many people at once. 50 understands that once silence becomes the norm, it hardens into policy. And when that happens, nothing ever changes. That's why he keeps pushing, even when it costs him relationships, goodwill, and invitations. But here's the reality most people miss. Noise alone has never scared powerful people. What scares them is when noise turns into something they can't bury. This is where the conversation shifts from noise to structure. Because Elon Musk doesn't operate on outrage, he operates on infrastructure. And that changes everything. While others argue on podcasts or trade accusations through interviews, Elon controls something far more permanent. He owns X, formerly Twitter. That isn't just a platform, it's an archive. Years of private messages, quiet connections, deleted posts that still exist somewhere, metadata that shows who talked to who, when, and how often. The kind of information most people assume disappeared the moment they hit delete. That's why his involvement hits differently. Blackmail doesn't need hidden cameras if messages already exist. It doesn't need secret recordings when private DMs can establish relationships, timing intent, and coordination. A single thread can tell a longer story than any leaked tape. And once that kind of data is in play, deniability gets a lot harder. What makes Elon especially dangerous to the system is that he doesn't need Hollywood. He doesn't need access. He doesn't need approval. He doesn't rely on studios' labels or award shows to maintain relevance. That independence removes the leverage most powerful industries depend on to keep people quiet. There's no career to threaten, no invitations to revoke, no deals to cancel. And that's why the dynamic changes here. Because when someone who doesn't need favors starts asking uncomfortable questions, the usual pressure points stop working. You can ignore noise. You can outlast headlines, but you can't negotiate with stored data, and once data enters, the picture patterns start appearing. This is where people get uncomfortable because the comparison everyone keeps avoiding isn't about identical actions, it's about identical leverage. When Jeffrey Epstein finally fell, the shock wasn't just what he did, it was how he operated for so long. The model wasn't built on chaos. It was built on access, on carefully curated environments, on creating situations that quietly compromised powerful people, and then letting fear do the rest. That's the parallel no one wants to say out loud. Not the crimes themselves, the structure behind them. Epstein's real power didn't come from money alone. It came from proximity, who he could introduce you to, where he could place you. And once someone crossed a line knowingly or not, silence became automatic. Not because someone threatened them directly, but because exposure would destroy everything they'd built. That same question is now resurfacing around Diddy, and it's far more unsettling than any single allegation. Who was being fed to him and by whom? Because people don't just stumble into environments like that repeatedly without someone opening doors, without someone normalizing it, without someone higher up deciding who gets access and who doesn't. And once you start asking that question, it becomes obvious this can't be limited to one genre, one circle, or one industry. Systems like this don't survive in isolation. They require layers, buffers, fall guys, and most importantly, people who never appear on the surface when everything finally explodes. That's why focusing on one name misses the point. Because once you recognize the model, you start looking for the structure behind it. And that brings us to the part nobody ever wants to map out. Once you stop looking at individuals and start looking at structure, everything snaps into focus. This system doesn't operate randomly. It's layered, protected, designed to survive exposure, and it functions like a pyramid. At the bottom is level 1, the visible celebrities. These are the faces everyone recognizes. The ones in headlines, the ones who take the heat when things go wrong. They act as the shield. Their fame absorbs outrage. Their downfall satisfies public anger. And when one of them collapses, it creates the illusion that accountability has been served. That's where Sean Diddy Combs fits. He was powerful, no question. Influential, feared. But in a system like this, power doesn't mean immunity. It means usefulness. And once that usefulness turns into liability, even the most connected figures become expendable. Above that is level 2, the industry gatekeepers. These are the executives, fixers, legal minds, and quiet decision makers who control access. They decide who gets signed, who gets booked, who gets protected, and who gets erased. They don't appear in scandals. They manage them. This level is about control, not visibility. And then there's level 3, the untouchables. These are the names that never trend, the ones no one dares to accuse directly. They don't need to speak because the system speaks for them. Silence is their shield. Distance is their protection. And as long as the lower levels absorb the fallout, this tier remains untouched. That's why lower levels fall first. They're designed to. But here's the thing about pyramids. When one layer cracks, the pressure doesn't disappear. It travels upward. What's revealing right now isn't the accusations themselves, it's the reactions. Because when real power feels threatened, people don't wait for proof. They preemptively explain themselves. And that's exactly what's happening. You're seeing the same language pop up again and again. I left early. I didn't see anything. I was never around that part. On the surface, those sound like innocent clarifications. But look closer, and the contradiction becomes obvious. You only explain what you're afraid of being tied to. No one defends themselves against something they believe can't touch them. These statements aren't denials, they're distancing maneuvers. And that's new. In past scandals, silence was enough. People could wait it out. Let the headlines move on. Let someone else take the fall. But now, silence isn't neutral anymore. It reads as strategy. It raises questions instead of closing them. And once questions start stacking up, PR teams move fast to contain damage before names start circulating in the wrong way. That's why the panic feels uneven. Some people are calm, others are rushing to frame their proximity. Some disappear completely. Others suddenly want the public to know exactly which rooms they were and weren't in. That behavior tells you more than any rumor ever could, because fear doesn't show up as screaming. It shows up as over-explaining. And the reason this moment feels different is simple. People sense that this time the usual cleanup might not work, that receipts might outlast spin, that distance alone might not be enough if patterns start emerging. Panic only happens when something real is at risk, and right now, it's clear that something is. Then there's the part of the story that never trends the paperwork. Because long before statements go public, the real movement happens behind closed doors. And that's where people started noticing something strange. The same attorneys appearing in multiple places, the same crisis managers quietly stepping in. Different cases, different faces, but familiar hands shaping the response. That overlap isn't proof of anything by itself, but timing is. In situations like this, intent is always debatable. Timing isn't. When legal teams move early before full details surface, it signals preparation, not surprise. It suggests that certain people aren't reacting to accusations, they're anticipating exposure. And that distinction matters. You don't coordinate defenses unless you believe there's something to coordinate against. What's especially telling is how quickly narratives get framed. Which claims are challenged, which ones are ignored, which details get emphasized, and which ones are quietly redirected. Legal strategy becomes reputation strategy, and reputation strategy becomes containment. That raises an unspoken question no one wants to answer directly. Who's trying to control the fallout before names surface? Because controlling damage isn't about innocence or guilt. It's about proximity, about knowing that if one thread gets pulled, it won't stop where people think it will. Alignments form when interests overlap, not when stories are true. And right now, the alignments are lining up fast. No accusations are needed to notice that. All you have to do is watch who moves first, who moves together, and who never seems surprised. Those patterns don't emerge by accident. They emerge when people understand how close the fire really is. And just when it seems like the connections stop at industry insiders, the story takes a turn no one expected. Because there's another group tied into this that doesn't belong anywhere near entertainment. At this point, the story stops being about music. Because when you follow the trail upward, the scope widens fast. What starts in entertainment doesn't stay there. It moves from music into media, from media into influence, and from influence into legitimacy. That's the real escalation most people miss. Power doesn't survive on talent alone. It survives on moral cover. Every system like this needs institutions that don't just protect reputations, they sanitize them. Places that signal trust, figures that project authority, environments where association itself becomes a shield. Once someone is wrapped in credibility, questioning them feels inappropriate, even dangerous. That's why certain institutions matter more than labels or studios ever could. They don't generate headlines, they generate belief. When someone carries moral weight, spiritual, cultural, or ideological, they don't need to deny anything outright. Their reputation does the work for them. Doubt gets reframed as disrespect. Questions get labeled as attacks. And suddenly, the burden shifts away from the powerful and onto the people asking why. That's the fear driving this stage of the fallout. Because exposure here wouldn't just damage careers, it would destroy credibility overnight. Trust once broken at that level doesn't get repaired with PR statements. Authority collapses fast when people realize it was borrowed, not earned. And unlike entertainers, these figures can't simply disappear for a while and come back with a new project. Their power depends entirely on being believed. on being seen as above suspicion. That's why this part of the story makes people uneasy, because once legitimacy is questioned, everything beneath it starts to wobble, and the protections that worked for decades suddenly feel fragile. And this is where the story stops being comfortable. This is the moment where conversations start to stall, not because people don't have opinions, but because they're afraid of saying a name out loud. At the very top of the pyramid, nothing is introduced directly. There are no hard accusations here, no courtroom claims. What exists instead is pattern recognition. And patterns don't rely on proof, they rely on behavior. Watch the reactions. When questions surface at this level, the response isn't denial, it's deflection. It's reframing. It's a sudden shift into spiritual language. Vague statements about forgiveness, about moving forward, about not engaging with distractions. These aren't answers. They're shields. That's the difference that matters. Innocent people deny clearly. They say no, they draw lines, they confront accusations head on. Powerful people don't do that. Powerful people reframe the conversation so denial isn't even required. They speak around the issue, not to it. They lean on authority, faith, reputation, anything that makes questioning them feel inappropriate. That's why reactions tell you more than claims ever could. When a figure like T.D. Jakes becomes part of the conversation, the discomfort spikes instantly. Not because something has been proven, but because the implication alone threatens legitimacy. And legitimacy is everything at this level. Once doubt enters, it spreads fast. This isn't about guilt, it's about insulation. The closer someone sits to unquestioned authority, the less they deny and the more they redirect. That's how power protects itself at the top. And once you recognize that pattern, the story stops being about any single person. Which brings us to the real takeaway. By now, it should be clear that this story was never really about Sean Diddy Combs. He wasn't the beginning, and he won't be the end. What he was more than anything was visible. And in systems like this, visibility is vulnerability. When pressure builds, someone has to absorb it. Someone has to fall so the structure above can stay intact. That's why focusing on one man misses the larger truth. Systems don't protect monsters, they use them. They elevate them when they're useful. They tolerate them when they're profitable. And when the cost becomes too high, they let them go. The outrage gets satisfied, the headlines move on, and the deeper layers remain untouched. That's the cycle. And once you recognize it, the real question stops being, what did he do, and becomes, why was he allowed to operate for so long? Because permission doesn't come from the bottom. It comes from above. From silence, from protection, from institutions that benefit as long as nobody looks too closely. Diddy falling doesn't mean accountability was achieved. It means a pressure valve was released. So here's the unresolved question that matters most. If he was allowed to fall, who is still being protected? And more importantly, who benefits from you believing the story ends here? Because the most dangerous figures in any system aren't the ones everyone is watching. They're the ones hiding in plain sight.